evening, ladies and gentlemen. Martin, our subject tonight is what's next for Israel. But before we get to that, perhaps we should talk for a moment about what's just happened to Israel. Did you ever think during those almost 9 months of talks that you were so deeply involved in that you would get a deal?
First of all, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming out on such a cold night. It's a real pleasure for me and an honor to be back at the 92nd Street Y. So what I was going to say was that at the outset, when Secretary John Kerry asked me to take on this job, I had to suspend disbelief. I think I'd been quoted in the New York Times fairly close to that event saying that the gap between the two sides was too great for a peace agreement to be possible, that the minimum that Abu Mazen, the Palestinian leader, would need was far more than the maximum that Prime Minister Netanyahu could give, and therefore the gap was too wide. So I was on the record as saying that, and that was essentially what I believed. But I'm a kind of sucker for lost causes. For 35 years, I've been essentially devoted my life to trying to achieve a secure peace for Israel with its neighbors, not just the Palestinians, but Syrians and the Egyptians, Jordanians, Lebanese as well. And so, you know, when he did me the great honor of asking me to help him in this effort, after he had done something miraculous that nobody believed was possible, he actually got the two sides to negotiate again. They hadn't negotiated for 4 years. So therefore, you know, we had to give it our best shot, which was exactly what we did. Now you asked, was there any moment there? Yeah, you cannot do the job unless you basically come to believe that it's possible. And it was actually at the end of the 9 months when we were struggling night and day to find a way to renew the negotiations for another 9 months. And part of me thought, this is completely crazy. It's been hopeless all the way through. There's nothing can be done. But there was another part of me, the optimist, that said, you know, over 9 months, we have dealt intensively with all of the core issues in the conflict. Both sides have made it clear what their needs are. Not so much what they're prepared to give, but what their needs are. All three parties, including the United States, now have a very good sense of it. There is a trust that's been built between the negotiators. And perhaps most importantly of all, we had come up with a whole articulation of a security plan designed to make Israelis more secure, not less secure, in the context of a final peace agreement with the Palestinians that would have required an Israeli withdrawal from most of the West Bank. And General John Allen, who's now responsible for the coalition against ISIS, was delegated by the President and Secretary of State to work on this with the Israelis, security chiefs, and with the Palestinians. And so we had kind of developed that piece to a point where it could have been done. So there was a sense that if only we could have 9 more months, it actually would make a difference because we had come a long way.
So if it made sense to go forward, what caused the breakdown? Was it that Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, now aged nearly 80, wasn't prepared to make, in the end, the tough sacrifices that were needed? I was told recently that when he was presented with the American plan, Tzipi Livni told me this when I was in Tel Aviv recently, he never really gave an answer. He just kept umming and ahhing and in the end walked away from it? Or was it the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel went on doing tenders for new construction in the West Bank, building continued on the settlements, and that seemed for a while to be the quid pro quo for the prisoner release, Where do you place the blame?
Well, there's enough blame to go around, let's put it that way. I think that what you just said about both sides is accurate in its essence. But I think that reflecting on it, as I've had some time now to do, the fundamental problem is about trust. And that explains a lot of what you just said. The whole Oslo process was designed as an interim process to build trust and confidence between the parties. When it was signed, and many of you will remember that moment on the White House lawn, September 13th, 1993, when Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat shook hands and resolved to end their conflict peacefully through negotiations and mutual recognition. That agreement that they signed then was supposed to last for 5 years, during which the Palestinian Authority that was to be established by the agreement would take progressive control, first in Gaza, which they did, and in Jericho, and then in the West Bank, which they did under the Oslo II agreement. They took control of 90% of the Palestinians in 40% of the territory of the West Bank. And then it was supposed to segue into final status negotiations on all of the core issues, including Jerusalem, final borders, security arrangements, refugees, and the issue of mutual recognition. And that negotiation was supposed to be concluded at the end of 5 years. It is now 21 years. And the last agreement...
And there's maybe less trust than there was 2 decades ago.
The last agreement was struck 16 years ago. And so that process of building trust never really got off the ground. What it was replaced by as we moved to the final status negotiations under Clinton was the Intifada. The collapse of the negotiations, the outbreak of the Intifada, and that, far from building trust, destroyed all the trust. I mean, thousands of people were killed on both sides, the most horrendous suicide bombings and terror, and of course Israeli retaliation for that. And to rebuild trust, once it's been broken like that, is much more difficult than it was to build the trust in the first place. So there is a fundamental disbelief on both sides in the intentions of the other, of the good intentions
absent
of the other.
That trust, the Palestinian side has now gone what looks like a unilateralist route, trying to get a resolution at the United Nations that would set a term for Israeli withdrawal and define the borders of a future Palestinian state, joining the International Criminal Court despite repeated undertakings to you and others that it would not do that. Where does this unilateralist route lead? It seems to me there can't possibly be a peace unless the two sides are speaking to each other. So is this just a feel-good move on the part of Abu Mazen, saying to Palestinian people, look, I'm doing something? Is it a drive to try to isolate Israel and so cajole Israel into taking new steps toward peace? Where does it lead?
Well, it doesn't lead anywhere good, that's for sure. The unilateralism that you describe is a product of this breakdown in trust. And it's not just between the people on both sides, it's between the leaders as well. The relationship between Abu Mazen and Bibi Netanyahu is toxic.
Toxic?
Toxic, absolutely toxic.
Did it ever look untoxic in those moments? Not really.
Not really.
No.
There was, interestingly, just as a side light, there were suggestions that we should get them together once the negotiations got moving again. And Prime Minister Netanyahu actually expressed an interest in this, and I went to Abu Mazen and said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Yes, that's a good idea." And then I came back to Washington and we sat down and we thought, now, is this really a good idea? We came to the conclusion that actually it would do great damage. It would not be good at all. Because what Abu Mazen would do, and he made it clear to me subsequently, would be to ask Netanyahu, are you prepared to withdraw to the 67 lines? And Netanyahu would say, presumably, no, because his whole coalition would collapse were he to say that. Yeah. Because the right wing of his coalition is absolutely opposed to any return, giving up any territory, but certainly not to return to the 67 lines. And then the next question Abu Mazen would ask would be, when are you ready to withdraw?
Well, that's what he's trying to define at the UN now.
Exactly. Yeah. It's those two things were the two things that he wants to know from Netanyahu. And those, Netanyahu's answer to the question when you will withdraw, he says, we have to be on the Jordan River for many decades. And the last time he said that to Abu Mazen walked out of the negotiations and didn't come back for the four years. So, they only lived 20 minutes apart from each other. But the lack of trust between them was so great. And it got worse during the negotiations. It didn't get better. It got worse because Netanyahu was releasing prisoners as part of the deal. Right. The deal was he would release prisoners who had blood on their hands, were terrorists and murderers. He would release them in return for Abu Mazen not going to the United Nations, not going to the ICC. And that was the deal for 9 months. Right? 4 tranches of prisoners, no moves in the UN or to the ICC. Yet, when Netanyahu released the prisoners, it became so problematic for him politically. I mean, across the board, 90% or more of Israelis were against the release of these murderers. So he responded to that by announcing more settlements, and then finally declaring that Abu Mazen had agreed to these settlement announcements as part of the release of the prisoners. Now, that wasn't the deal that Abu Mazen had agreed to. And for Abu Mazen, who, by the way, had been welcoming these prisoners home as heroes, which made matters even worse on the Israeli side, Abu Mazen had never agreed to more settlement activity for the release of the prisoners. And he was then portrayed in front of his people as having done that by the Prime Minister. And that was a humiliation for him, that he had sold Palestinian territory for the sake of these prisoners. So it undermined any good that would come from these prisoners being released. So that just gives you one small example of the way in which the relationship has become so toxic, as I said before, that you were just running around trying to kind of calm things down and hold it together.
I'm getting pretty depressed listening to you, man.
It was a depressing experience.
Since last April, we've had a Gaza war with more than 2,200 dead. There's a steadily rising tide of violence, including a stabbing in Tel Aviv today, horrible incident. The Palestinians have gone off on this unilateralist route that doesn't seem to lead anywhere. What are we heading toward in your view? And do you see any situation in terms of what's next for Israel? After all, if the current situation remains, we all know that it's very hard for Israel to remain a Jewish and democratic state. We also know that the status quo that is often referred to, kicking the can down the road, preserving the status quo, seems to involve things like the last Gaza war. The regular violence is part of the status quo. So can you console us in any way? Can you see any way out of this impasse?
It's hard to see. I think you're right that all of the vectors are heading in a negative direction. And it's very difficult to see anything positive. Now, of course, Israel is in an election process, March 17th. There'll be an election result. It'll take probably 4 to 6 weeks for a government to be formed. The trend to the right has been present in Israeli politics for some time. And, you know, the terrorism, the violence, the belief that there is no partner, underscored now by the fact that Abu Mazen is pursuing this unilateral route and now going to the ICC, therefore trying to put Israel into the dock of a criminal court rather than negotiate peace with it. All of that has created a circumstance in which nobody in Israel is running on a peace platform. Nobody is saying, I'll do a better job of making peace. They're all competing for who will do a better job of dealing with socioeconomic problems. So you've got that dynamic is negative between the two sides. Plus you've got this move by the Palestinians to the international arena, to the UN Security Council. And there, it's much easier for the Palestinians to deal with that because there they have an automatic majority on their side. Not yet in the Security Council, but when they go back again, it will be the case. And the United States will probably have to veto. But they'll keep on using it. It's an easy one for them.
Yeah.
They don't have to make any compromises in that. It's the Israelis that are isolated and pressured. So there's every reason why they will continue to do that, and not a good reason to believe that the next Israeli government is, you know, likely to put pursuing peace as its first priority. Now, you could get a centre-left government that in Israel, led by Bougie Herzog and Tzipi Livni, and maybe that would change things somewhat.
What do you think is the likelihood of that? When I was in Israel in December, I did sense that a lot of Israelis feel there's a shelf life for any leader in any democracy. And on and off, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been leading Israel for 9 years now. And I did sense for the first time that Israelis, if given a credible alternative, an alternative that would assure their security, that they were at least prepared to look at that. I also sensed that several leading political figures in Israel might be prepared to join a Livni-Herzog coalition. And I do think my own sense is that one perhaps basic difference between Herzog-Livni and Prime Minister Netanyahu is that while they are very strong on security, they do have a genuine, heartfelt belief in the need for a two-state outcome if one could possibly be found that guaranteed Israel's security. I've never been entirely convinced that that was the case with the Prime Minister. So how high do you rate the possibility of change? And if it came, would that change the dynamic for any future negotiation because of this genuine quest for a two-state peace, perhaps under a Herzog or Livni prime ministership?
Look, I think you're right. I was in Israel around the same time as you, and I did my polling of taxi drivers.
I went a little beyond that.
Very accurate way of reading, not really, but I was struck because taxi drivers normally are the Likkud's part of the Likkud's core constituency, and every one of them said it's time for Bibi to go home. You know, he hasn't achieved anything. We've had enough. Time for a change.
That's what Amos Oz told me.
Yeah, but he's a nice. I love Amos, but he's a little bit to the left of most Israeli voters.
Yeah.
So he's not. But taxi drivers are not Amos-Oz. They probably don't read Amos either.
Yeah.
But so I do think there's that feeling. It's reflected in the polls that 60% of Israelis say they don't want Netanyahu as their prime minister. But on the other hand, when you look at the polls that do the kind of beauty contest of who would be a better prime minister, Netanyahu is still a good 15, 17 points ahead of Bougie Herzog. And so in that respect, because Israelis do vote for the leaders of the parties rather than the parties themselves, Herzog still has a ways to go, but there's 2 months left in the election cycle, and the undecideds are still quite high. I think around 25 to 30%. They normally break to the right, but you don't know what could happen in that regard, and it's conceivable. I don't think at this point it's likely, but it's conceivable that the centre-left could put together a coalition. The critical point here is it's all a matter of mathematics, because you've got these small parties, and the parties have grown smaller over time. Likud and Labour have dropped dramatically. When Sharon won, he won with 50 seats. And at the moment, Likud and Labour, or they call Labour's now calling itself the Zionist camp, are neck and neck at all of 24 to 25 seats. And so they have a lot more need for coalition building with these smaller parties. The parties of the right tend to have more votes, more seats. That's what the polls show. And therefore, even if Netanyahu doesn't come out with the most seats, he could still form the government. That's exactly what happened last time.
Yeah.
Tzipi Livni came out with one more seat, but he could form the government. Now, if a gap opens up because of the feeling that it's enough with Netanyahu, and Herzog is able to get, let's say, 4 seats or more ahead of the Likud, it's conceivable then, depending on how the other parties do, that he could be asked to form a government first. And I don't know how closely you all follow Israeli politics, probably not
closely, I suspect,
in the obsessive way that I do, but Netanyahu went to great pains to try to stop Ruby Rivlin from becoming president. Went to extraordinary lengths. It seemed to be irrational. He failed. But this is the scenario that he was trying to block. Ruby Rivlin, who doesn't like him, would ask
Herzog,
the alternative leader, to form the government. Because once Herzog does that, he's in a position to trade, to offer, to buy the votes. And in particular, he has a good relationship with the Orthodox parties, who may be the swing votes here. His grandfather was the first chief rabbi of Israel. He's a very good consensus builder. See how he brought Tzipi Livni in to his camp. And so if he's in that position, then he
could
may actually be able to pull it off.
It's interesting that the Herzog camp is calling itself the Zionist camp, in the sense that it's portraying itself as the camp that can preserve Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, rather than the messianic Zionism that holds that all the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the river is Israel's and was deeded to Israel in the Bible. And I think it's interesting the way it's trying to return Israel to that original Zionist vision. As part of his election campaign,
Could I just interrupt you on that, because I think it's an excellent point, that yes, this is all part of trying to paint an image that they're the Zionists. But the subliminal message is the other guys are post-Zionist.
Yeah.
And that's particularly interesting when it comes to Naftali Bennett and the Jewish Home Party, which is on the right of the Likud, but he's definitely the one to watch. He's full of energy, he's surging in the polls, he's got 16 seats now in the polls, and he basically argues, as you said, that we should forget about the two-state solution. The way to solve this problem is for Israel to annex 60% of the West Bank. He wrote that in the New York Times. And the Palestinians can have autonomy in the rest and economic peace. And so, even though it's not being debated, there are in this election, there are two very different, starkly different visions.
Yeah, I think it's a very critical election. As part of the election campaign, we've learned in the last 24 hours that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to come to Washington, and he's going to address the joint houses of Congress. And this was organized, it seems, by Speaker Boehner without informing the White House. And President Obama is not in the least happy about this. And one can understand that. You said relations between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas were toxic. I don't know if you would care to apply that adjective to the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President. Certainly, the relations don't look good. What do you make of this gambit of Prime Minister Netanyahu, once again going around the White House, straight to Congress, where he's presumably going to speak out vociferously against any deal with Iran, which is likely to anger the president further? Are we on the eve of a very big Israel-US clash?
Yeah, I worry about that a lot. I believe that the US-Israeli relationship is critically important to Israel's future. After all, we're supposed to be talking about what lies ahead for Israel in the future. And a strong US-Israel relationship is Israel's second line of defense. It's Israel's force multiplier when it comes to deterring those that would seek to destroy Israel. And it's just critically important to Israel's survival. And so it's precious. It needs to be nurtured by both sides, since both sides have an interest in it. And it needs to be protected. And I worry a great deal about what we're about to go into now as a result of this invitation by Speaker Boehner and acceptance by Prime Minister Netanyahu, as you said, behind the back of President Obama, because it injects the Congress into Israeli politics. He's
for the election.
Be here 2 weeks before the election.
Yeah.
And, you know, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand what that will mean. Clearly, the Prime Minister will get repeated standing ovations. That will be the picture that will be projected on the Israeli television screens right before the elections. And the message will be, everything's fine in my relationship with Congress, since you don't like Obama anyway, and Obama is not popular in Israel. You know, the Congress has our back. You don't have to worry about the US-Israel relationship. But the consequence of the Congress now injecting itself in that way on the side of Netanyahu is highly problematic for the relationship. And on the other side, Netanyahu is injecting himself in the battle between the Congress and the president not over the deal, but over whether there should be more sanctions.
And he said in the State of the Union previous night that he would veto
Correct.
Any attempt by Congress to
impose more sanctions. Yeah. And what Netanyahu is being brought to the Congress for is to make the case for more sanctions. And
what's the message in Prime Minister Netanyahu agreeing to do that? Is it really that he does not care any longer about his relationship with the president or what President Obama might do?
Yes, I mean, there's no other way of understanding it, because why wouldn't you? I mean, he speaks to Secretary Kerry every other day, sometimes twice, 3 times a day.
That's a pretty radical step.
And for him, as I understand it, he didn't tell Kerry. Yeah. He didn't tell the White House. The White House has already said publicly it's a breach of protocol because, you know, a foreign leader doesn't come to Washington without informing the White House. than the State Department. So it's an approach which is bound to create a good deal of anger in the White House. So why would you do that? I mean, the president is going to be there for 2 more years.
Yeah.
He's just taking on the Cuba lobby.
Yeah.
And he's basically saying, I'll veto any effort to impose new sanctions. So there's the potential here for him to take on the Jewish lobby. Because I assume that AIPAC, the pro-Israel community, will get behind the Prime Minister. And so, you know, we're going to move from a kind of what was a Democrat versus Republican argument, with some Democrats supporting the Republicans on this issue of sanctions, to the president versus Israel and its supporters. And that's not a place where we want to be. Anybody who cares about the US-Israel relationship should not want to be there.
And presumably, if the president feels that an Iran deal is doable, that would cut the size of the Iranian nuclear program, ensure that it could not lead to a nuclear weapon, that it was highly monitored, highly limited, only compatible with civilian use, all the things that have been negotiated these past several months. Presumably, he would do that if he believed that it was in the US interest, and that would compound everything you've just described.
Right. Right. He made the argument last night that to impose new sanctions now, by the way, it's important to understand, as I think I understand, what the legislation would do is impose new sanctions if the deadline, that's the new deadline that's been set, which I think is for June, is not met.
Yeah.
So what the president is concerned about, as I understand it, is that this is like telling the Iranians there's a gun to your head.
Yeah.
Right. If you don't do the deal, you know,
he's right
more sanctions are going to be imposed. So the Iranians are unlikely to respond kindly to this, and there's a potential for the negotiations to break down as a result of that. And there's a potential for the coalition that's been put together to support the American effort to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, for that coalition to break up, because the Russians, who, despite the fact that we're sanctioning them, are still on board for this effort against the Iranian nuclear program. They may walk out of it. The Chinese may walk. The Europeans. We depend on the Europeans for the effectiveness of the sanctions that we are imposing. So there's a danger that the whole thing could unravel. And what the president is saying, and he said it last night, is if we do that, then we're left with one option, because the Iranians will start up their nuclear program again, and then we're left with a military option. And he said last night, you know, I'm not going to do that unless I've exhausted all the other possibilities. So you can see how he's positioning his argument to say that those people who want to impose sanctions actually want the United States to go to war with Iran.
Martin, the conflict has also been seeping into Europe. We saw this at the time of Gaza, when we saw vile anti-Semitic slogans in the streets of Germany. I was a correspondent in Germany for 3 years. If you told me that there'd be Germans shouting "Jews are pigs" again in the streets of Germany, I would have said, no way. We've had the shooting in the Jewish Museum in Brussels, most recently, of course, 4 Jews killed in the kosher supermarket. In Paris, we have marginalized Muslim communities very much on edge. We have a foul and heinous ideology that claims its roots in a Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, and that's been metastasizing now for 35 years, ever since the fatwa against Rushdie. You have growing frustration and impatience in Europe with Israel. In Europe, Israel tends to get blamed more than the Palestinians. How worried are you about what's going on in Europe, how this can lead to further isolation of Israel, how the Jews of Europe, the situation that they now find themselves in? There's a modest exodus that could become a less modest exodus of Jews from France to Israel. You have Jews in the Netherlands taking mezuzahs down from their homes as a precaution. Things that really seemed unimaginable even a short time ago. How do you view all this?
Well, with deep alarm, and I think we all should be alarmed that in our time we're seeing the resurgence of an anti-Semitism that I had assumed was long past, and it's coming back with a vengeance in all of the ways that you describe. We have governments that are standing up to it, in particular the French government, German government, but European governments are indeed, doing their best to speak out against it. But the circumstances are very problematic, and we've seen this before. The economic circumstances in Europe, particularly in France, but in other countries as well, with high unemployment rates and these marginalized communities that you spoke about of Muslim immigrants are probably worst affected by the economic circumstances. And so you have a combination that is highly problematic and very worrying. And I should turn the question back on you because Roger has written...
I'm not sure you're allowed to do that.
Roger has written a really poignant book about Jewish identity and Jewish insecurity and the search for a Jewish homeland. So maybe, why don't you answer the question? How do you feel about it?
Well, I wrote the book because I felt that my family's past had largely been hidden or buried, and it's a past of Jewish immigrants from Lithuania to South Africa, where my parents were born. They were fleeing the pogroms in the Pale of Settlement, and then my parents left South Africa. I was born in London and then went back to South Africa for 2 years, and then my dad hated apartheid and left to pursue his medical career in Britain. I, in turn, have become an American. And all through that saga, as I researched it, I mean, obviously in Lithuania, where, of course, all the Jews were slaughtered during World War II, there was this question, do we belong? Are we really part of this society? I found the diary of my great uncle, who was, it turned out I didn't know this, was a rabbi during World War I, and he was chaplain to Jewish soldiers in the British Army at the battlefront. He was going around Flanders and other places giving last rites to Jewish soldiers. And in his diary, he asks, have we, the house of Israel, finally demonstrated to king and country that we are prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice, and that we too are British patriots? Will we belong? And of course, a German Jew who had served at the front during World War I with distinction and had an Iron Cross didn't stop him being taken to the gas in World War II, so it was an entirely legitimate question. And I've been thinking a lot, as this has happened in France, about the fact that 120 years ago, of course, France was divided by the Dreyfus case, where a Jewish officer in the French forces was accused falsely of treason. And France was then divided into Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards, who were, many of them, anti-Semites as well. And there was a foreign correspondent doing what I do, covering the case, and his name was Theodor Herzl. And one of the reasons why he wrote The Jewish State in 1896 was precisely that he had concluded that Jews would never be entirely accepted into European societies. Indeed, that half acceptance emerging from the shtetl might be even more dangerous, as it turned out, than non-acceptance. And I think, Zionism is kind of a dirty word in Europe these days. It's very interesting, having moved from here, where I've tended to be criticized for my criticism of Israel, to Europe, where I tend to be criticized for being a Zionist, because I believe very strongly in the need for a Jewish state. I also believe there should be a Palestinian state alongside it, if that can be done, while securing Israel's security. But I think recent events have just demonstrated once again how prescient Herzl was. And this anxiety was always present in my family. I mean, Britain is probably the most open of societies in Europe, but as nothing compared to the openness of the United States, where I genuinely think that people don't really care where you're from, they care what you can do.
Right.
And that is not really the case in Europe, where there's the whole question of ancestry. And I was struck in the New York Times the other day when a French Jewish woman was interviewed and described her background, then turned and said, mon mari, and my husband, he's a real Frenchman. So,
Even
not being Jewish. So, again, you see that distinction. Anyway, I tried to explore a wider theme of repetitive displacement and more intimately my family's story of my mother's breakdown, which I link to this repetitive upheaval because, of course, immigration is new opportunity. That's its bright star, but its black sun is loss. Gosh, where were we? Do you think, it's sometimes said by Prime Minister Netanyahu and others that, in fact, even if there were an Israeli-Palestinian peace, it would not stop this radicalization that we see in the Islamic world. It would really not make a dime of difference to anything if Israel and Palestine made peace. What do you think? Would it impact ISIS? I mean, there are thousands, let's not exaggerate, not tens of thousands, but thousands of young Europeans from Britain, from Germany, from France, going off to swell the ranks of an organization that's beheading American journalists. Suppose tomorrow there were a peace. Would they be less inclined to do that?
No. No, but I do think that several points. First of all, it's not about Israel doing anybody a favor. It's about Israel looking to its own well-being. And people by now are familiar with the argument, but it doesn't go away. That is, Israel does have an existential dilemma that comes from its control over Palestinians. And that existential dilemma that people are familiar with, it results in, if Israel stays in control of that population in the West Bank and in kind of semi-control of Gaza, that eventually, sooner rather than later, if not in this decade, certainly in the next decade, Jews will be a minority in the land of Israel. And then, Israelis will be forced to choose between the Jewish nature of the state and the democratic nature of the state. And there's now a party, the Jewish Home Party, which says, it's the Jewish nature that matters, and the democratic issues can come later. And we already saw that right-wing Knesset members are introducing legislation that will reduce the democratic nature of the state of Israel. So the whole notion of a Jewish and democratic state is going to be questionable as time goes on. And Israel will find itself, it's already happening, but it will find itself more and more isolated and more subject to the kind of horrendous boycott and sanctions and that movement that is gaining steam. And so for its own sake, Israel needs to find a way to resolve this problem. And Israel has agency. It is not a victim anymore. That is one of the great achievements of
sometimes
Zionism.
you look at booming Tel Aviv and this incredible modern society that has been created in 66 years, and you think this question, is it sustainable, is it non-sustainable? You think, well, heck yes, it certainly looks sustainable, but you're suggesting that is a bit of an illusion, that sooner or later despite its incredible vibrancy, success, and when things are quiet, resemblance to parts of California, be careful, that's a bit of an illusion. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's totally, not a bit of an illusion,
Yeah.
complete illusion.
Right.
What's happened, unfortunately, is with good reason, Israelis have turned their backs on the Palestinians. They put up a wall, they arranged for security coordination between the Israelis and Palestinian side, and that, together with the work of the Shin Bet and the Israeli security forces, had until now dramatically reduced the violence and terrorism coming from the Palestinian side. And the economy was doing great. The startup nation was riding through the recession that the rest of the world was going through without any problems. But now the chickens are coming home to roost. Now we see, as mentioned today, another lone wolf attack. 12 Israelis stabbed on a bus. Fortunately, nobody has died, 2 are in critical condition. But that, we've seen it, we've gone through that in the summer. We see that kind of thing. It's not organized by Hamas. God knows they're trying in all sorts of different ways. The kidnapping of those 3 Israeli kids was a perfect example of that. But there are Palestinians who are going out and doing what we saw the ISIS people do in Paris. And that is much, much harder to control. And in those circumstances, security goes down.
Yeah.
The economy is now this quarter in negative growth. And we come back to what the Palestinians are doing on the international stage. And you have circumstances in which Israel has to find a way to solve this problem.
Yeah. Now, I have several questions from the floor. I'm going to read them in the order I was given them. And this is a question, actually not from the floor, but from Orlando, Florida. What does a, quote, normal citizen say to other people who say Israel is not interested in peace when Israel is faced with enemies who are sworn to its destruction?
Look, Israel has a very strong and clear record of peace seeking. And in the case of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and the Palestinians, Israeli governments have repeatedly offered to withdraw from territory in exchange for peace agreements and ending the conflict and mutual recognition. So Israel has a strong and clear record of attempting to make peace. And that's something that needs to be pointed out and repeated. So I think that's the first thing that needs to be said. That storyline gets muddled because of one factor more than anything else, and that is Israeli settlement activity in the West Bank. And as long as the settlement activity in the heart of the West Bank continues, the credibility of Israel's commitment to peace is questioned. Why? Because if there's to be a two-state solution, then the Palestinian state has to be created somewhere. And there's only one place for it, that's the West Bank. So if Israel is settling and building in that territory for Israelis, then it raises a question mark over Israel's intentions. The sad reality of this unfair world is that when Israel is giving up territory, it's applauded and embraced. When Ariel Sharon pulled the Israeli troops and settlements out of Gaza completely, he was a hero in the UN, 10 years before, he was being pilloried as the butcher of Beirut. But when Israel is settling territory, particularly in the West Bank, then it is seen not as committed to a two-state solution and resolving the conflict with the Palestinians peacefully, but it's rather seen as an occupying force trying to take the territory for itself. And of course, you've got right-wing leaders in Israel saying that's exactly what we're going to do. Yeah. We're going to annex the territory. So that's where the argument becomes much more difficult.
Now, a question from David, who's in the audience. Does Abu Mazen have enough credibility to make a deal? If not, how can an agreement be crafted that would be upheld?
I would, with David's permission, substitute the word credibility to legitimacy. Mm-hmm. Because I think he's talking about the same thing, but it's the legitimacy that is the problem for Abu Mazen. He has not faced his people in an election since, I believe it's 2005, when the last presidential elections were held. He, therefore, not only suffers from a lack of legitimacy, he feels the lack of legitimacy. And that leads him to be very cautious, very unwilling to take a stand that would lead him to be accused by Hamas on the one side, by his detractors formerly from Fatah, that's mainly Mohammed Dakhlan, on the other side, that he is betraying the Palestinian cause. And, he's 80 years old, and I think he fears that more than anything else. And I believe that is why, when we come back to where we started with your question, you said, that Tzipi Livni told you that he didn't answer the president when the president put forward these proposals. That is the reason why. Because even though the president's proposals were designed to meet his needs, consistent with Israel's security needs, even though the president of the United States was leaning forward towards him, it would have required him to compromise on a variety of issues. And he was like, I can't answer you. He didn't want to say no, but he could not say yes.
So he said nothing.
So he said nothing. He said nothing.
And here we are. Here's a personal question, Martin. What role do you play in the peace process between Israel and Palestine? What do you personally define as peace? How do you soothe the anger and hatred in the hearts of both peoples?
It's a very good question. We tried. It's us personal. So I tried, along with Secretary Kerry and the peace team that we had assembled, to deal with this question in the context of our feeling that if we were able to get the deal that we were trying so intensively to negotiate, it would require a huge leap of faith on both sides. And we were dealing with what I've described already as so much distrust, so much water under the bridge, so much time having passed without any progress in the negotiations, that to move from there to an agreement which would have required hard and painful compromises on both sides was going to be really difficult. So the question is really important in that context. How are we going to convince both sides that the other side was really serious? And so we spent a lot of time quietly talking to people on both sides that could play a critical role in standing for this painful compromise. And what we discovered in that process is that, notwithstanding all of the distrust, the people wanted on both sides. Yeah. They really would like what President Clinton referred to back in 1993 on the White House lawn as the quiet miracle of a normal life. And that if they, that the years that have passed have not been totally wasted, in the sense that I think people on both sides, majorities on both sides, have come to understand what it's going to take, what the compromises would require in order to get there. And so, notwithstanding everything I've said, I think strong leaders committed to making the peace, able to understand and help the other leader with his domestic problems, and this has to be mutual. If they were ready to stand before their people, if they had the courage to do it, the courage of a Sadat and a Begin and a Rabin and a King Hussein, that the people would support them. The people are tired of this conflict. It's become a chronic conflict. And so in that sense, if you asked before, is there any hope? That's the hope. That's the hope that after all of this, you still see in the polls that majorities on both sides want it. They just don't believe the other side does.
So it requires statesmanship that we've not seen.
That is the critical missing ingredient. Above all, when you had, as I said, when you had leaders who were ready to break the mold, who had the courage to risk their political lives and their physical lives, the United States was able to get behind them, provide them with a safety net, and help them move forward, and that's what made the difference. Without leaders on both sides, it requires 2 to tango, 3 to tango. You need the United States as well. But without those leaders, it's not possible.
Segueing from that, there's a question here: where would negotiations and an environment of willingness be had Yitzhak Rabin, been able to continue his work, so to speak? Seemingly this was one of the most effective assassinations in history, in that it derailed what at that moment seemed like a potentially plausible way forward to peace.
It wasn't just Rabin, of course, it was also Sadat.
Yeah.
Both assassinated by their own people, I mean,
like Gandhi.
Jew and Egyptian, in respectively. And in both cases, I mean, let me speak for a moment about Sadat. We forget what an incredibly courageous statesman he was. You can read about it in Larry Wright's book on Camp David, or the play's coming here to Broadway soon. And he was in a position as the president of Egypt to lead the Arab world to peace. Eventually, I mean, they boycotted him and so on, but it didn't bother him, and he was determined to move forward. And he had such a sense of the psychology of the other, of the Israelis, which was critically important in terms of speaking to that fear that Israelis have. It goes back to the insecurity that you were talking about of all Jews because of our experiences. So taking him out was the first blow. Taking Rabin out was, a huge setback. I thought, I was ambassador at the time that Rabin was assassinated. I was in Israel. And I thought at the time that things had progressed enough that it would be impossible to turn it back. Boy, was I wrong. But here again, we go back to the issue of trust. Arafat was the artful dodger. He was not to be relied on. Abu Mazen is different in that regard, by the way. I think he's a better person than Arafat was. But Rabin understood him. And Rabin knew how to build his confidence. And how did they do it? They had a back channel, not to do negotiations, but to deal with each other's needs. There's a guy named Yossi Ginosar, former Shin Bet guy, and he would go back and forth. And Arafat would say, look, I've got this problem I need your help with. And Rabin would say, I've got this problem. And they actually built a relationship of trust based on a sensitivity to the other's political difficulties. And that's why Rabin was able to move and manipulate Arafat into a position where he would agree to things that you know, Shimon Peres once said to me afterwards, we got too good a deal. We would, you know, because the two of them manipulated Arafat into making these agreements, into making the concessions. And Arafat, for all of his sins and problems, did have legitimacy amongst his people. Rabin's assassination, if Rabin had not been assassinated, what I'm saying is I believe that they would have gotten to a final deal. It's the counterfactual, but after he was assassinated, it's been downhill ever since.
Yeah, it amazed me reading Wright's book on Camp David and reviewing it for the New York Review of Books. You know, they were there for 13 days, holed up in the hills of Maryland. And Begin, who was the first right-wing leader of Israel, went into the talks with one core conviction. He would never, ever, under any circumstances, give up the Israeli settlements in Sinai. He was going to retire there. It was an essential buffer against the Egyptians. There had been repeated wars. There was one thing he would not do at Camp David. And lo and behold, after 13 days, and with the president just keeping going, and the fierce pragmatism of Sadat, which I think is a forgotten word in the Middle East these days. I mean, Sadat knew what he wanted. He wanted Sinai back. And he wanted to align himself with the United States rather than with Moscow. And what did Begin do? He gave up the settlements in Sinai. So it's never impossible.
Right.
It's never impossible with the right leadership.
That's true, but he did something else as well.
Yeah.
He kept the settlements in the West Bank.
He did, despite having pledged the president that he would not. But we won't get into that. We'll go on quickly to another question. What can the Palestinians do as an independent state that they can't do now or could not do now if they had cordial relations with Israel? And how will these capabilities improve their lives? In other words,
how will having a state improve their lives?
Yeah. And couldn't they just cooperate economically and be okay?
Sure, it'd be great if they would abandon their claims to right to self-determination. Everything would be just great. Naftali Bennett could have his way, and Israel could annex 60% of the West Bank, and life would be glorious. But it doesn't work like that. Why should the Palestinians now abandon what they consider to be the same right that Jews have in Israel, to self-determination, to live in their own state? Why should they be the ones to give it up when the whole world supports them in doing it? So as nice as it would be, it is a fantasy. It is not going to happen. Those people who argue that, all we got to do is improve their economic conditions and everything will be fine, don't understand that basic reality is that they want a state of their own. They've been promised a state of their own, not just by the international community that's now voted for it in the UN General Assembly and by all of these parliaments in Europe that are voting for it. They've been promised it by successive Israeli governments and by successive presidents of the United States, starting with George W. Bush, Not Bill Clinton, by the way.
And the original UN resolution of 1947
Provided
that created the State of Israel called for 2 states, one
Well,
Jewish, one Arab.
They, of course,
Yeah,
rejected.
the Arab armies then invaded.
But they've now come to believe that this is their fundamental right as a people. Yeah. And that is not something that can be taken away just because we would find it a more compatible solution for Israel.
Then we have a question from Orlando, which is about Boehner's invitation to Netanyahu. What do you personally think of this invitation?
Well, I think I've made it pretty clear that I think it was a mistake. It's a mistake to inject the Congress into the Israeli election process. You know, it's true that Bill Clinton, when he was president, intervened in the Israeli elections trying to support Shimon Peres. It was totally counterproductive. I think that successive presidents of the United States have learnt that lesson. You know, just now we had a situation where there was talk about introducing a UN Security Council resolution to head off the Palestinian efforts, introduce a fair and balanced resolution. The British, the French, and the Germans were working on that. It was something that the President and the Secretary of State decided should not happen now because it would be seen as some kind of interference in Israeli elections to try to put the peace process into the heart of the campaign through the UN Security Council. So they purposely avoided that and protected Israel from that. And I don't think it's wise for the Congress to be doing this. Or if they're going to do it, here's a new proposal. Yeah, they should invite Bougie Herzog and Tzipi Livni to speak to the Congress at the same time. Thank you.
I think he's trying to drop the nickname Bougie, at least that's what I heard.
Good luck.
He thinks it doesn't come over with the appropriate gravitas of a future leader. There's a question from me, which is, who is creating the greater obstacle to peace? The Israelis with settlements or the Palestinians with incitement of the youth to hate Jews? Well, look, I don't think there's a competition here. Both of these are clearly major obstacles. And I always think that one of the big problems in the conflict is this competitive victimhood. You know, who suffered most, whose narrative is more valid. You know, whether the narrative of the Palestinians about 1948 is more valid or that of it doesn't matter. If you want peace, you've got to look forward. You've got to make the decision that putting food on the table for your kids and building 2 societies, which maybe 100 years from now will have a border that's as relevant as the border between France and Germany, is more important than proving some point. There's no question that the settlements, as Martin has said, send a very clear message, in my view, to the Palestinians, which is, we may be talking to you, but we're really not that serious about a 2-state peace. Because if you're serious, how can you go on expanding your presence in the only sliver or piece of territory, now 22% roughly of the Holy Land, where a putative Palestinian state would come into being? The message is negative, and if you're trying to create a positive environment for peace talks, then in my view, that is unhelpful. And equally, what does the continued incitement against Israel and against the Jews in Palestinian media and elsewhere say? It says, well, we may talk to you about a 2-state peace at or close to the 1967 borders, but in fact, we just hate Jews, and we want to chase you into the sea. And our project hasn't changed since 1948, when Arab armies invaded. We're not serious about peace either. We simply want to drive Jews out of this area. And I saw, when I was in Gaza recently for a few days, couple of days, I saw a Hamas leader who told me precisely that. I wrote about it in the Times. He said, Jews don't belong here. They're a foreign body. They have to be extirpated. And America's big. Why don't you just create a big Jewish district in the United States and take these 6 million Jews who are in Israel and plunk them down in America? I talked to another Hamas leader. Hamas, I don't think, is monolithic. And he was talking about potential compromise at the 1967 borders, then to be followed one day by a sort of one-state idea, which I think is completely unrealistic. So the answer to the question is that, I'm not going to say which is greater. Both pose serious obstacles, and it would be very helpful if both stopped.
I agree with that.
And there's a last question here. Well, it just says Resolution 242, not total withdrawal, 67 wars started by Arab states, security without Jordan Valley for Israel. Well, let's just take the last of those questions. Prime Minister Netanyahu always says, look at Gaza, look what happened when we withdrew. He said during the last Gaza conflict, this shows us once and for all, we can't have a state in the West Bank. Ben Gurion Airport's going to be hit. And a fundamental part of his argument is that the Jordan Valley, even though Jordan has diplomatic relations with Israel and is at peace with Israel, that unless Israel continues to occupy the Jordan Valley, which I think is about 20% of that 22%, can Israel be secure without having its troops in the Jordan Valley?
Yes, it can. And this was precisely what I was referring to before in terms of the very serious effort involving hundreds of military experts on the American side under General Allen's leadership has been focused on to try to come up with a security concept with all of its component parts, which I'll mention in a moment, that will leave Israelis more secure, not less secure. And it's not a simple proposition because I'm sure most of you will know that the West Bank cuts into Israel such that at Israel's narrowest point, I think it's 9 kilometers wide. And in that narrow strip in the coastal plain is where Israel's population, industry, infrastructure is all concentrated. So the Prime Minister Netanyahu has a very real and totally reasonable concern about if rockets brought into the West Bank like they're in Gaza, it would cripple Israel. And no Israeli Prime Minister can accept that. So it's a very real challenge. And of course, there's the broader context of, ISIS is now on the border with Jordan. And there's understandable concern in Israel about whether the King of Jordan is going to be able to deal with that. I think that with our help and Israel's help, he's been very capable of dealing with it and will continue to be. But there's that concern. So all of these issues have to be dealt with, but it doesn't mean it can't be resolved. It's complicated, it's difficult. It partly involves a phased withdrawal so that Israel can test the security arrangements over time. And Abu Mazen has agreed to that concept. The gap between them is quite large in terms of Bibi saying 30 years and Abu Mazen, depending on what day of the week it is, sometimes he says 3 years, sometimes he says 5 years. But you could see that particular issue could get resolved so that there's time to test the arrangements. That was the same thing that's happened in the Sinai as well. So that's number one. Number two, there has to be a capable Jordanian force on the Jordanian side of the border. There has to be a capable Palestinian force on the Palestinian side of the border. There has to be American engagement forces, they're leading that effort, training up the Palestinians, bolstering the capabilities of the Jordanians, working with the Israelis while they are still there to ensure that the security arrangements are going to hold. And there has to be a testing of those arrangements, testing of the capabilities of all the parties involved. And there needs to be technical support for that effort in terms of early warning systems, and there's all manner of ways in which Israel can monitor what's going on and, if necessary, move back in after it's withdrawn, and there needs to be security arrangements to enable that to take place as well. So there's a combination of circumstances and purposeful efforts on all sides that can meet the security concerns, the very legitimate security concerns of Israel. We are convinced, as a result of the work that was done by General Allen, that there is a way to achieve that objective of making Israelis more secure as a result of the withdrawal.
Thank you very much, Martin. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree. There's no more committed diplomat working for a two-state peace that ensures Israel's security than Martin Indyk over many years now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.